The funeral director checked his watch at 10:42 a.m. My father's service was supposed to begin at 10:30. 38 people sat in the small chapel at Renford Memorial House. Wet coats hung over chairbacks. Rain pressed against the narrow, stained-glass windows. The room smelled of lilies, damp wool, and the cedar polish they had used on my father's casket. The chair beside me was still empty. It belonged to my brother, Callum. I had placed the folded program on the seat myself. Our father's photograph was printed on the front. He was 68 in the picture, standing beside his old red fishing boat with one hand on the railing and the other shielding his eyes from the sun. Callum had approved the photograph 3 days earlier. He had sent one message after that. "Looks fine, I'll be there." I looked at my phone again. No new messages. The funeral director leaned toward me and said he could hold the service another 10 minutes. I said, "Start now." His eyes moved to the empty chair. I repeated it. "Start now." At 10:45, the chapel doors closed. My brother was not stuck in traffic. He was not sick. His car had not broken down. At 9:18 that morning, he had posted a photograph from a lakeside cabin 70 miles north of Renford. He stood between 3 friends on a wooden deck, holding a silver travel mug. A pine forest rose behind them. The caption said, "The old crew was finally together again." I recognized the jacket he was wearing. It was the navy wool coat our father had bought him for his 30th birthday. Callum had chosen a weekend with his friends over our father's funeral. I put my phone face down on my lap as the first piano note filled the chapel. My father had been dead for 6 days. He had collapsed in the hardware room behind his house at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning. The paramedics arrived 9 minutes later. By the time I reached the hospital, his watch and wallet were already sealed inside a clear plastic bag. The doctor told me the heart attack had been immediate and severe. There had been no long period of pain, no hours of fear. I held on to that because there was not much else to hold. Callum reached the hospital at 3:40 that afternoon. He stayed for 26 minutes. He stood at the foot of the bed after the nurses had removed the tubes and said, "Dad looked smaller than he remembered." Then his phone rang. He walked into the hallway to answer it. When he came back, he said he had promised his friends he would help organize their annual cabin weekend. The booking was non-refundable. 12 people had already paid. I stared at him. He said he knew the timing was bad. I said, "Our father died this morning." Callum rubbed both hands over his face. He said he understood that. He was just explaining the situation. That was how my brother spoke when he wanted selfishness to sound like a scheduling conflict. He explained. He never chose. He never refused. Things simply became complicated around him until someone else carried the weight. For most of our lives, that person had been our father. After the service began, I kept my eyes on the casket. I listened as Reverend Pell described my father as dependable. The word was accurate, but too small. My father, Edwin Mercer, repaired industrial refrigeration units for 39 years. He left home before sunrise and returned with oil under his fingernails. He could hear a failing compressor from across a warehouse. He kept every receipt in labeled envelopes and sharpened pencils with a pocket knife. He raised Callum and me, alone, after our mother died when I was 11. Callum was 14. Our mother had been ill for 18 months. During that time, our father learned how to braid my hair, cook 4 meals that did not come from cans, and sleep in a vinyl hospital chair without complaining. He was not affectionate in an easy way. He did not talk about feelings while washing dishes. He showed love through completed tasks. A repaired bicycle waited beside the garage door. A full tank appeared before a long drive. A jar of soup sat on the porch when one of us was sick. When I was 23 and moving into my first apartment, he measured every doorway before the delivery truck arrived. He carried the sofa upstairs himself, because the delivery men said it would not fit. When Callum opened a mobile coffee trailer at 28, our father loaned him $24,000. The trailer closed 14 months later. Our father never asked for repayment. Callum called it an investment that had not worked out. Our father called it family. I was 36 when he died. Callum was 39. I worked as a property inventory specialist for an insurance firm called Harrow and Vale Assessments. My job was to enter houses after fires, floods, and structural failures and document what remained. I measured rooms, I photographed damage, I made lists of objects people had stopped seeing because those objects had always been there. 6 dining chairs, 1 oak cabinet, 47 hardback books, a chipped ceramic dog beside the fireplace. My work trained me not to look away when a room had changed forever. It also taught me that grief made people unreliable witnesses. They remembered what mattered emotionally, not what was physically present. They said a necklace had been on the dresser when it was still inside a safe. They insisted a painting had belonged to a grandmother when the purchase receipt was dated 8 years later. I did not judge them. I wrote down what I could verify. After our father died, I used the same method in his house. I opened each drawer, I photographed each room, I recorded the serial numbers on his tools, I placed his insurance papers, bank statements, property deed, and will in separate folders on the dining table. Callum came by once. He arrived on Wednesday evening, carrying 2 empty storage bins. Our father had been dead for 34 hours. Callum walked directly to the den and asked whether Dad's wristwatch had been found. It was a stainless steel Halden watch from the 1980s, not especially valuable. Our father wore it every day until the leather strap cracked, then stored it in a green felt box. I told Callum the watch was still in the desk. He said Dad had always intended him to have it. I asked when Dad had said that. Callum paused. Then he said it was understood. I wrote the watch on the inventory sheet and put the felt box into a sealed carton. Callum watched me tape it closed. He said I did not have to treat him like a thief. I said I was treating the estate like an estate. He laughed once, without humor. Then he asked about the house. Our father's house stood on Alder Row, a narrow street lined with sycamore trees and low brick homes built in the 1960s. He had bought it with our mother when he was 27. The mortgage had been paid off for 11 years. Callum walked through the kitchen while talking about property prices. He opened the back door and looked at the garden. He said the lot might attract a developer because it was wider than the others. I stood beside the dining table, holding a folder containing the death certificate application. I said, "The funeral is Saturday." Callum said he knew. I asked if he had canceled the cabin trip. He looked at the floor. Then he said canceling would create a mess for everyone. I waited. He explained that his friend Patrick had flown in from another state. Neil had arranged childcare. 2 couples had taken Friday off work. The cabin company would not issue a refund within 7 days. I said, "Dad's funeral is not movable." Callum said he had not said it was. I asked whether he planned to attend. He said he was working it out. That was Wednesday. On Thursday, I sent him the final schedule. Family arrival at 10 well, service at 10:30, burial at 11:40, lunch at the Caro Hall dining room at 12:30. The solicitor would read the will at our father's house at 4 o'clock. Callum responded with a thumbs-up symbol. At 6:12 on Friday evening, I called him. Music played behind his voice. He said they had reached the cabin early because the weather forecast was worsening. I said, "You are already there." He said only for the first night. He still might drive back in the morning. I asked whether he had been drinking. There was a pause. He said he had 1 beer. I told him not to drive after drinking. He said he knew that. I said, "Then you have already decided." Callum lowered his voice. He said everyone was expecting him to stay. He had arranged the whole weekend. They had been planning it for 8 months. I looked through the kitchen window at our father's garden. Rainwater collected in the empty bird bath. I said, "Dad spent 39 years arranging his life around us." Callum said that was not fair. I said, "The funeral starts at 10:30. He said he would try. I ended the call. At 8:03 on Saturday morning, his message arrived. Weather bad. Roads slick. I'll see how it looks in an hour. The rain in Renford was steady but light. The regional road service listed no closures between the cabin and town. At 9:18, he posted the photograph on the deck. At 9:24, Another friend posted a video. Callum stood near an outdoor grill while someone poured sparkling wine into plastic cups. At 9:31, I took a screenshot. Then I dressed for our father's funeral. I wore a charcoal coat and the pearl earrings my mother had left me. I arrived at the memorial house at 9:52. I signed the final paperwork. I checked the flowers. I made sure Reverend Pell had the correct version of our father's obituary. At 10:18, the funeral director asked whether we should delay. I said 5 minutes. At 10:25, I said another 5. At 10:42, he asked one last time. I looked at the empty chair. Then I said, "Start now." During the service, our father's former co-workers filled 3 rows. Mr. Danner, who had worked with him for 22 years, cried into a white handkerchief. Mrs. Bell from next door sat behind me. She placed one hand on my shoulder during the final hymn. Callum's name appeared in the printed program beneath mine. Beloved father of Mara and Callum. The words did not change because one child was absent. At the cemetery, the rain grew heavier. Water darkened the shoulders of my coat. The ground near the grave was covered with green matting, but mud pushed through at the edges. The funeral director offered me the umbrella that had been reserved for family. I stood beneath it, alone. When the final prayer ended, each person placed a small sprig of rosemary on the casket. Our father had grown rosemary beside the kitchen door because our mother used it in roast potatoes. I placed mine first. Then I stepped aside. The rosemary Callum should have carried remained in a shallow wicker basket. After the burial, people drove to Caro Hall. The dining room had cream walls and low windows facing a wet courtyard. We served vegetable soup, roast chicken, potatoes, and the lemon cake our father ordered every year on his birthday. I moved between tables. I thanked people for coming. I listened to stories I had never heard. Our father once drove 40 miles at midnight to repair a freezer at a retirement home because their medication could not be allowed to warm. He kept spare gloves in his van for apprentices who forgot theirs. He refused to bill a young couple after their refrigerator failed the week they brought home a newborn. These were not dramatic acts. They were small, completed duties. That was who he had been. At 1:17, my phone vibrated. Callum had sent a message. "Sorry I couldn't make it. Hope it was a good service. Save me some cake." I read it twice. Then I locked the screen. Mrs. Bell approached while I was standing near the coffee table. She was 74 and wore a violet scarf pinned with a silver leaf. She asked where Callum was. I said he had chosen not to come. Her eyes stayed on mine. She did not ask me to soften it. She said, "Your father knew who showed up." I felt something tighten behind my ribs. I said, "I hope so." She said, "He did." At 2:06, the last guests left. I wrapped 2 pieces of lemon cake in foil. One was for Mrs. Bell, the other was for me. I did not save one for Callum. I returned to our father's house at 2:40. The rooms felt colder than they had that morning. His brown shoes still stood beneath the coat hooks. A mug with a faded picture of a lighthouse sat upside down beside the sink. 3 unopened envelopes lay on the hall table. I carried the flowers from the service into the kitchen and divided them between 2 glass pitchers. At 3:12, I changed out of my wet coat. At 3:28, I placed 4 chairs around the dining table. One for me, one for Callum, one for Mr. Adrian Sorrell, our father's solicitor. One for his assistant, who was bringing the original documents. At 3:46, Mr. Sorrell arrived alone. He was a narrow man in his early 60s, with silver hair and a black leather case. He had handled our father's property purchase, our mother's estate, and several revisions to our father's will. He removed his wet overcoat in the hall. Then he looked toward the empty chair at the table. He asked whether Callum was coming. I showed him the message from 1:17. "Sorry I couldn't make it. Hope it was a good service. Save me some cake." Mr. Sorrell's expression did not change. He said the will could be read without Callum present. There was no legal requirement for both beneficiaries to sit in the room. He could send Callum a certified copy afterward, I knew that. My work often brought me into contact with estates. I had inventoried houses where heirs argued over watches, furniture, tools, paintings, and even half-used bottles of perfume. I had learned that a will did not create a family's character. It revealed it. Still, I had planned to wait. I had set the fourth chair. I had printed an extra inventory. I had placed a pen beside Callum's copy. At 3:58, I called him. The call rang 6 times. He did not answer. At 4:01, I called again. This time, he declined it. A message appeared 30 seconds later, in the middle of dinner prep. Can we do this tomorrow? I looked at Mr. Sorrell. He sat with both hands resting on the closed leather case. I asked whether my father had chosen 4 o'clock specifically. Mr. Sorrell said yes. 3 weeks before his death, our father had come to the office and left written instructions. He wanted the will read in his dining room at 4 on the day of the funeral, provided neither child had a medical emergency. I looked at the clock above the kitchen door. The second hand past 12. It was 4:02. I moved Callum's empty chair back against the wall. Then I sat down. I said, "Read it without him." Mr. Sorrell opened the leather case. The sound of the brass clasps carried through the room. He removed a cream folder, 2 sealed envelopes, and a small digital recorder. I had expected the will to be simple. Our father's house divided equally, his savings divided equally, personal items assigned by name. That was what he had told us 5 years earlier. Callum believed the same thing. He had already mentioned using his half of the house sale to clear credit card debt and invest in a new hospitality project. I had told him not to make plans around money he did not yet own. He said I worried too much. Mr. Sorrell placed the will on the table and said it had been signed 11 months earlier. That surprised me. Our father had not mentioned a recent change. Mr. Sorrell read the opening provisions. Funeral expenses, outstanding bills, appointment of executor. My name appeared. I was named sole executor of the estate. Callum was named as alternate, only if I was unable or unwilling to serve. I pressed my fingertips against the grain of the table. Mr. Sorrell continued. Our father's tools, van, refrigeration equipment, and professional manuals were left to the Renford Technical Apprenticeship Trust, a small fictional training program he had helped establish with former co-workers. His fishing boat went to Mr. Danner. His books went to the local mechanics library. My mother's jewelry came to me. The Halden watch went to Callum. Mr. Sorrell paused. He slid one sealed envelope toward me. My name was written across the front in our father's block handwriting. Then he returned to the will. The house on Alder Row did not pass equally to Callum and me. It passed entirely to me. I looked up. Mr. Sorrell kept reading. Our father's savings were divided into 3 portions. 20% went to the apprenticeship trust, 20% went to Callum, 60% went to me. Callum's outstanding personal debt to our father, documented at $31,800, was forgiven in full. The will stated that the forgiveness should be considered part of Callum's inheritance. I sat very still. The original loan had been $24,000. There had been more after that. $7,000 for rent, $800 for a vehicle repair. Our father had written it all down, not because he intended to collect it, because he kept records. Mr. Sorrell finished the financial provisions. Then he turned to a separate page titled Statement of Intent. He explained that the statement was not necessary for the will's validity. Our father had requested that it be read aloud because he did not want either child inventing reasons after his death. Mr. Sorrell read our father's words. He had not changed the will because he loved one child more. He had changed it because equal love did not require equal distribution when circumstances and contributions were unequal. Over the previous 10 years, I had attended 37 medical appointments with him. I had managed repairs to the house. I had driven him after his cataract surgery. I had spent 14 weekends helping him clear our mother's belongings from the attic when he finally felt able to do it. I had never asked to be paid. Callum had borrowed money repeatedly. He had missed our father's 65th birthday dinner, 2 Christmas mornings, and the small memorial gathering held on the 20th anniversary of our mother's death. Our father wrote that Callum was not a bad man. He was a man who believed important moments could be postponed until they became convenient. Our father no longer believed his house should be divided in a way that forced me to sell it or buy out a sibling who had not helped maintain it. The room blurred for 3 seconds. I closed my eyes. Then I opened them again. Mr. Sorrell waited. I said, "Continue." Our father's statement ended with one final instruction. He did not want me pressured into changing the distribution out of guilt. He had made the decision with full understanding. He had reviewed it twice. He had chosen it because responsibility should leave evidence. Mr. Sorrell placed the document on the table. Outside, rain ticked against the kitchen window. The refrigerator motor started with a low hum. I looked at the empty place where Callum's chair had been. He had missed the funeral. Now he had missed our father explaining, in his own words, exactly why the estate was not equal. I asked Mr. Sorrell when our father had first discussed changing the will. He said 13 months earlier. That was 1 month after our father's fall from a ladder. He had fractured his left wrist and 2 ribs while cleaning the gutter above the garage. I had left work at 2:20 that afternoon. I drove him to urgent care. I stayed overnight because he could not pull a shirt over his head or lift a kettle. Callum sent a fruit basket. He lived 12 minutes away. He said he was too busy to visit until the following week. By the time he came, our father had already learned how to fasten his belt one-handed. Mr. Sorrell said the fall had not caused the decision by itself. It had forced our father to examine a pattern. He had asked himself who would actually manage the house if he became unable to live there. He already knew the answer. I picked up the sealed envelope with my name on it. The paper felt thick beneath my thumb. I did not open it yet. I asked about the digital recorder. Mr. Sorrell said our father had recorded a message for both of us. The recording was not part of the will, but he wanted it played after the formal reading. I looked at the clock. It was 4:39. I called Callum again. He answered this time. Laughter and music sounded behind him. He said, "Finally, what is going on?" I said, "The will has been read." The noise behind him seemed to recede. He asked why I had not waited. I said, "Dad instructed that it be read at 4 today. Callum said he had asked to move it until tomorrow." I said, "Dad did not." He was silent. Then he asked what the will said. I looked at Mr. Sorrell. He gave a small nod. I told Callum he would receive a certified copy. Callum's voice sharpened. He said I was already acting like I controlled everything. I said, "I am the executor." He asked what he had been left. I told him about the watch. I told him about 20% of the savings. I told him the $31,800 he owed Dad had been forgiven. Then I told him the house had been left to me. The background noise vanished completely. Callum asked me to repeat it. I did. He said that was impossible. I said it was written plainly. He said Dad always said the house would be divided equally. I said Dad changed the will 11 months ago. Callum breathed into the phone. Then he asked whether I had pressured him. The question did not hurt as much as I expected. It clarified everything. I said no. He said I had been around Dad constantly. I had access to his paperwork. I had arranged appointments. I had made myself indispensable. I looked at the stack of medical calendars I had collected from the desk drawer. Each appointment was written in our father's hand. Mara driving. Mara collecting prescription. Mara bringing groceries. I said, "I did not make myself indispensable. You kept making yourself unavailable." Callum said I had no right to judge him for one weekend. I said, "The will was signed 11 months before this weekend." He had no answer to that. I told him Mr. Sorrell would send the documents on Monday. Callum said he was leaving the cabin immediately. I asked whether he had been drinking. He said that was not relevant. I said, "Do not drive if you have been drinking." He accused me of changing the subject. I said no. I am refusing to attend another funeral. Then I ended the call. My hand shook once after I placed the phone on the table. I pressed it flat against the wood. Mr. Sorrell waited until I looked at him. He said our father had anticipated that Callum might challenge the will. The file contained medical evaluations completed 2 weeks before signing, handwritten notes from 3 separate meetings, and a video statement confirming that our father understood his assets and his decision. The witnesses were independent. The solicitor who prepared the final revision had not previously represented me. Every step had been documented. Our father had built the will like one of his repair reports. No loose wires, no missing serial numbers, no room for someone to claim the failure had come from nowhere. Mr. Sorrell pressed a button on the digital recorder. There was a soft click. Then our father's voice filled the dining room. It was weaker than I remembered from the year before, but steady. He said the date first, then his full name. Then he said the message was for Mara and Callum. He did not know who would hear it first. He hoped both of us would be sitting at the table. He said he had spent most of his life fixing equipment that failed because people ignored small warning signs. A strange vibration, a loose connection, a temperature that rose by 2 degrees each week. Families were not machines, he said, but people ignored patterns in much the same way. He said Callum had a generous spirit when generosity was exciting. He paid for drinks, he planned trips, he gave large birthday gifts, he made people laugh. But he disappeared when generosity became repetitive, quiet, or inconvenient. Our father said he had protected Callum from that truth for too long. He had covered debts, made excuses, changed dinner times, accepted apologies that arrived after the work was finished. He said that was his own mistake. Then he spoke to me. He said I had inherited my mother's habit of carrying a full tray without admitting it was heavy. He said I should stop confusing endurance with duty. He said the house was mine because I had helped keep it standing, but I was not required to live there, preserve it, or turn it into a museum. I could sell it, rent it, paint every wall, remove the garden, keep only one chair. His voice paused. Then he said, Mara, do not wait for your brother before living your own life. You have already waited enough. The recording clicked off. For several seconds, neither Mr. Sorrell nor I moved. The wall clock showed 4:57. I opened the envelope with my name. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small brass key. The note was dated 2 months earlier. Our father wrote that the key opened the bottom drawer of his workshop cabinet. He had left something there that did not belong in the formal estate documents. Mr. Sorrell packed the will into its folder. He asked whether I wanted him to stay while I checked the workshop. I said no. He placed Callum's certified copy into his case. Before leaving, he told me he would handle all communication about the estate if I preferred. I said I would send Callum one written summary that evening. After that, he could contact the office. Mr. Sorrell nodded. At the front door, he put on his wet coat. He said my father had been very clear. I looked toward the dining room. I said, he usually was. After Mr. Sorrell left, I locked the door. I carried the brass key into the workshop. The room stood behind the garage and had once been a storage shed. Our father had insulated it, installed fluorescent lights, and built a long workbench beneath the east window. His tools hung on a pegboard in dark outlines. Each wrench had a place. Each screwdriver faced the same direction. The air smelled of metal, sawdust, and the orange hand cleaner he used after work. The bottom drawer of the gray cabinet had no label. I inserted the key. Inside was a flat wooden box. My name was written on a strip of masking tape across the lid. I set the box on the workbench. It contained photographs. Not formal ones, ordinary moments. Me at 16, asleep at the kitchen table beside an open chemistry book. Me at 24, kneeling on the floor of my first apartment with a paint roller. Me at 31, standing in our father's garden with mud on both knees. Beneath the photographs was a narrow black notebook. Our father had written dates inside. Not expenses, not debts, visits. January 12th. Mara brought soup. Stayed 2 hours. February 4th. Mara drove me to eye clinic. March 19th. Callum called. Good conversation. 15 minutes. April 2, Mara repaired back gate. April 17, Callum cancelled lunch. Work issue. May 6, Mara and Callum both came for birthday. Good day. June 11th, Mara helped clear attic. July 3rd, Callum asked for loan. The entries continued for 4 years. Some favored me, some did not. There were days Callum came, days he took our father to a game, days he brought groceries, days I cancelled because of work. Our father had not built a case against him. He had recorded what happened. The final entry was written 9 days before his death. Mara replaced kitchen tap. Callum called from airport, said he would visit Sunday. Callum had not visited Sunday. He texted that his return flight had exhausted him. I closed the notebook. My phone showed 7 missed calls, all from Callum. There were 4 messages. The first said he needed to speak to me privately. The second said his friends believed the will could be challenged. The third asked whether I had taken anything from the house before the inventory. The fourth said he was on his way. I checked the time. 5:41. He could not have reached Renford that quickly if he had left immediately after our call. I opened the cabin photograph again. A bottle stood on the deck railing behind him. I sent one message. Do not come here tonight. The house is locked. Contact Mr. Sorrell on Monday regarding the will. I will send the estate summary by email. Callum responded before I set the phone down. This is my father's house too. I typed carefully. It was Dad's house. Under his will, it is now mine, subject to administration of the estate. Do not enter without permission. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. He wrote that I was enjoying this. I looked around the workshop. Our father's reading glasses rested beside a folded rag. A half-used pencil lay in the groove above the workbench. The calendar on the wall was still open to the month of his death. Nothing about the room felt enjoyable. I wrote back, I buried our father today. You were not there. I am not discussing your assumptions tonight. Then I blocked his number until morning. I returned to the kitchen. I moved his empty chair into the hallway. I cleared the unused copy of the inventory from the table. Then I sat in our father's place and ate the second piece of lemon cake. At 7:18, headlights crossed the front window. A car door slammed. Callum knocked hard enough to shake the narrow pane beside the door. I did not answer. He knocked again, then he called my name. I stood in the hall, 6 feet from him, with the door locked between us. He said he knew I was inside. I said, go home. He asked to see the will. I said Mr. Sorrell would send it. He said I was keeping him out of his own family home. I said, you kept yourself out today. He hit the door once with the flat of his hand. Not hard enough to damage it. Hard enough to make the brass chain tremble. I said, Callum, leave now. He said Dad would hate what I was doing. I felt the old reflex rise in me. Explain, soothe, make room. Give him enough information that he could feel less ashamed. Then I remembered our father's recorded voice. Do not wait for your brother before living your own life. I said, Dad left written instructions. I followed them. You chose not to be present. Callum stood silently outside. Rain ran from his hair onto the shoulders of his navy coat. Through the glass, I saw that his face was pale. He said he had made a mistake. I said, yes. He asked me to let him in. I said, not tonight. He lowered his head. For one moment, he looked like the boy who stood beside me in the hospital after our mother died. His hands hung at his sides, his shoulders folded inward. I wanted to open the door. That was the truth. I wanted to give him dry clothes. I wanted to heat soup. I wanted to tell him there was still cake. But opening the door had always become something larger with Callum. One night became 3. One loan became 5. One explanation became permission to avoid the next difficult thing. I said, go home safely. We can speak after you have read the documents. He looked at me through the glass. Then he turned and walked back to his car. I watched until the red taillights disappeared. On Monday morning, Mr. Sorrell sent the certified copy. At 9:12, Callum emailed me. The message contained 16 paragraphs. He said our father had been lonely and vulnerable. He said I had been closer to the situation and had influenced him without recognizing it. He said a 20% share of the savings was insulting. He said forgiving the debt should not count as inheritance because our father had never expected repayment. He said the house belonged to both of us emotionally. He ended by asking me to agree voluntarily to a 50-50 division before lawyers became involved. I did not answer immediately. I printed the email. I read it once with a pen in my hand, not as a sister, as an inventory specialist. Claim: father was vulnerable. Evidence: medical evaluation confirmed capacity. Claim: I influenced him. Evidence: 3 documented meetings with independent counsel. Video statement: no involvement from me. Claim: debt was not real. Evidence: signed loan agreements and bank transfers. Claim: emotional ownership. Evidence: not a legal asset. I did not send him those notes. I forwarded the message to Mr. Sorrell. Then I wrote one response. Dad made his decision independently and documented his reasons. I will administer the estate according to his will. Further questions about the distribution should go to Mr. Sorrell. Callum replied that families should not communicate through solicitors. I did not respond. For the next 4 weeks, I worked through the estate. I canceled our father's utilities. I notified his pension administrator. I transferred the insurance policies. I met 2 former co-workers at the workshop and watched them pack the donated tools. Mr. Danner collected the fishing boat on a bright Thursday morning. He ran one hand along the red railing and cried without hiding it. He told me our father had once taken Callum fishing every Sunday for an entire summer because Callum was struggling at school. I knew that. I had forgotten the number of Sundays. Mr. Danner asked whether Callum wanted the boat. I said the will had left it to him. Mr. Danner looked toward the house. Then he said he would keep our father's name painted on the stern. The boat was called Maribel, after our mother. I said that would be good. Callum filed a formal notice disputing the will in the 5th week. He did not accuse me of fraud directly. His solicitor requested medical records and information about the preparation of the document. Mr. Sorrell provided them. The challenge lasted 3 months. It ended after Callum's solicitor reviewed the capacity evaluation, the video statement, the dated notes, and the debt records. Callum withdrew the notice. I learned about it through a 2-sentence email from Mr. Sorrell. There was no courtroom, no dramatic confrontation, no public defeat, only paperwork showing that our father had known what he was doing. During those 3 months, Callum and I did not speak. Mrs. Bell came over every Wednesday. We sorted kitchen items into boxes. 1 for donation, 1 for me, 1 for disposal. She held up our father's dented roasting pan and said my mother had burned potatoes in it during the first dinner they hosted on Alder Row. I kept the pan. I sold the house 7 months after the funeral. Callum heard about the sale through the estate report. He emailed to say he could not believe I had sold our childhood home so quickly. I looked at the date. 214 days had passed since our father died. I had spent 160 of those days maintaining an empty house. I had repaired the roof flashing, cleared the gutters, paid the taxes, mowed the lawn, scrubbed the workshop floor after the tools were removed. Callum had not asked to visit. He had not requested a key after the first night. He had not collected the Halden watch until Mr. Sorrell sent a reminder. I answered that the house had been sold to a couple with a 6-year-old daughter. They planned to keep the rosemary by the kitchen door. Callum said that was not the point. I did not ask what the point was. The estate closed 11 months after the funeral. Callum received his share by bank transfer. The forgiven debt was recorded. The watch had been delivered. Every item was accounted for. 2 weeks later, he asked to meet. We chose a cafe called North Lantern on the edge of Renford. It was fictional, quiet, and almost empty on weekday mornings. I arrived at 8:55. Callum arrived at 9:14. He wore the navy coat again, our father's coat. He looked older than he had at the funeral door. There were gray strands near his temples I had not noticed before. He sat across from me and placed the green watch box on the table. He said the leather strap had broken when he tried to wear it. I said it had been cracked for years. He nodded. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he said the cabin weekend had not mattered as much as it seemed. I waited. He said Patrick was moving overseas. The group might never be together again. Everyone had pressured him to stay. He had convinced himself the funeral was for other people because Dad was already gone. I looked through the cafe window at a delivery driver stacking crates on the pavement. Callum said he knew how that sounded. I said, "It sounds like what happened." He rubbed the edge of the watch box with his thumb. He said he thought I would cover for him. I looked back at him. He said I had always explained him to Dad. I told Dad when his job was stressful. I reminded him when Callum's finances were bad. I softened missed birthdays and canceled dinners. He said he assumed I would tell everyone the roads were dangerous. I said, the roads were open. He said he knew. Then he told me he had watched the funeral recording. The memorial house had sent him a private link at my request. He watched it alone 3 weeks after the service. He saw the empty chair. He saw me standing beneath the umbrella at the grave. He saw the rosemary left in the basket. He said that was the moment he understood I had stopped covering for him. I said, I stopped lying about what you chose. He nodded. There was no anger in his face, only fatigue. He asked whether Dad had hated him. I said no. Callum's mouth tightened. I told him Dad had described him as generous when generosity was exciting. He looked down. I told him Dad had also said he made people laugh and cared deeply in moments. Callum asked whether there was more. I had received a copy of the recording from Mr. Sorrell. I could have sent it months earlier. I had not, because Callum was challenging the will, and every communication had become part of an argument. I took a small drive from my bag and placed it beside the watch box. I said, Dad left a message for both of us. Callum stared at the drive. He asked why I was giving it to him now. I said, because the estate is finished. You cannot turn his words into a negotiation anymore. He flinched. I did not apologize. He closed his fingers around the drive. Then he said he was sorry he missed the funeral. I said, I know. He said he was sorry I stood there alone. I said, I was not alone. 38 people came. He understood what I meant. The apology did not change the funeral. It did not place him in the empty chair. It did not add his hand to the casket or his rosemary to the grave. But I believed he meant it. That was enough for the moment. We left the cafe separately. Outside, Callum paused beside his car. He asked whether I wanted the watch strap repaired. I said it was his watch. He said Dad wore it while teaching both of us to ride bicycles. I remembered. He held the back of my seat for 3 blocks before letting go without telling me. I rode another half block before realizing I was balancing alone. I told Callum to repair the strap. He said he would. Our relationship did not return to what it had been. There was no single conversation that restored it. He began calling on Sundays. Sometimes I answered, sometimes I did not. He invited me to dinner on our father's next birthday. I went. He placed the repaired Halden watch beside his plate. The new strap was dark brown. At 6:40, he raised his glass and said Dad should have been there. I said yes. We ate lemon cake afterward. A year after the funeral, I visited the cemetery alone. The morning was dry and cold. I carried a small pair of garden shears and trimmed the grass around our parents' shared stone. My mother's name appeared on the left, my father's on the right. I placed 2 rosemary sprigs beneath his name, one from me, one for the son who had not come when the chair was waiting. I did not pretend the second sprig changed the past. I left it because my father had loved Callum. Both things could remain true. My brother had chosen his friends over our father's funeral. I had read the will without waiting for him. The empty chair had not stopped the service. It had not stopped the burial. It had not stopped our father's final wishes from being carried out. When I finished, I folded the shears into my coat pocket. A light wind moved through the cemetery trees. I stood with one hand resting on the cool stone until the church clock struck 10:30. Then I walked back to my car without waiting for anyone to join me.